Hi, Marianne.
Hello, how are you?
Good. Good morning.
Good morning.
Did you receive an invite from the Cal invite?
Yes.
Okay, awesome. I know I added that kind of late. Hello, Pay.
Hi, Eric, and everyone.
Good morning.
Eric, how,
So,
how many folks
go,
usually show up?
how many it varies, especially when I change the time, which I usually do this at 2 p.m. Mountain Time on Thursdays. When I change it, especially if I change it like last minute, I'll get anywhere from 1 to like 10. But on the regular, I'll get, maybe around 10. In some cases, I've had like as many as 40 people. It just depends on how much I promote it. And I haven't been overly consistent or I guess active in terms of promoting it. I just kind of rely largely on word of mouth. And then I'll drop a comment and then I'll drop a comment in the NSA random channel. And sometimes I forget to do that. But yeah, I've found that when you get over 10 more than 10 people, it gets kind of quiet. And I don't like it. I don't like it. Like I'd rather have folks and I know I understand. I'm kind of the same way myself when I
Yeah.
join other people's webinars or whatever, so I get it, but I like it when it's a little bit small and intimate and like people are a little bit more apt to share and they're not as shy, but
Yeah,
Yeah.
sure.
Well, thanks so much for doing this. I'm excited. This is my first one, so I'm excited.
yeah, welcome. Awesome.
Yeah.
Awesome. So I'll give you the little spiel and we'll let folks trickle in. I started recruiting in 2013. In a former life, I was in product management and software product development, and even a former life, I was a mechanical engineer, and so I've had a bit of an eclectic, nonlinear, I guess, career path. So I've been recruiting again since 2013, mostly for startups, executive down to whatever, individual contributor. I was in the NSA for about a year. I moderated two groups, so I'm familiar with the playbook. And I think one thing that I found was that there was recruiting and sort of the recruiting mindset and the whole process behind the scenes was quite a black box. And so I found that just, casting a little bit of light on, that on that black box would help folks navigate their job search, their career, and even hiring, for folks that are either in that position of hiring or will be, as they start to grow teams, having more insight into that recruiter mindset and that whole process, I think is quite valuable. So that's why I do this. And I also get a lot of folks reaching out to me individually. And I'm like, okay, maybe it would stand to benefit me and others if I did this more in like a group setting. So that's sort of the background there. I don't structure this very much. It's usually sort of like an AMA conversation, and I don't promise to have all the answers, but what I do think I can offer is just the recruiter perspective,
Cool.
you know.
Thank
So
you. Yeah. Do you get
I
a lot of the same questions week
I
after
do.
week?
And it's okay. What it does for me. Hi, Matthew. Welcome. What it does for me is it kind of gives me an opportunity to sort of tease out kind of what I know. And I'm recording these, right? I record these and I put them on YouTube.
Mhm.
And more than that, what I like to think is I'm building effectively a database of my knowledge as it pertains to recruiting. And so I've done this in the past where I've created a digital twin using Delphi and that basically aggregates all these conversations in the form of a transcript and makes those sort of that knowledge base sort of accessible through a bot. I was paying for that, and I don't make any money off this, so like I stopped paying for it. But anyway, that's sort of the part of the motivation is to kind of tease out what I know about recruiting, and ultimately I'll be able to use that in some way, or some form or another. I think in YouTube they're starting to add more and more AI to it. So like you might be able to mine these episodes right through YouTube by asking it questions. I'm not
Hmm.
sure. But anyway, that's sort of part of what I'm interested in getting out of it. When I answer the questions over and over, I think when I answer the same question, the answer is different in some ways, right? So there's always some nuance that comes out that's a little bit different. So
Sure.
Can we start with those? I mean, I don't know if other folks have questions, but I'm like, I didn't know how this is going to work. I didn't come prepared with questions, so I'd love to hear what questions that you've answered a million times already, and maybe we can like vote and upvote or like, like I
For
like that.
sure, I'm game. And for everyone that just joined, I'm just kind of giving a little bit of background on kind of what inspired me to start this weekly thing. If you're a first timer here, I'm not going to repeat myself, but again, this is largely unstructured, so just chime in with any questions you might have about recruiting. I do try to put in some guardrails Like, because I don't want this to be just another JSC, right? I think what I have to offer here that's a little bit unique is my perspective as a recruiter. I've been doing this now since 2013, and my thought is to kind of cast a light on that black box that is recruiting, the recruiting mindset, the hiring mindset, the process, and so hopefully that'll help you navigate your search, your personal branding, and ultimately your career much more effectively. So again, I don't have much of a structure here other than just going over questions that folks might have, and feel free to drop it into the chat, the Zoom chat there, or just feel free to raise your hand, or just feel free to go old school and kind of just blurt it out. But Marianne, if you have a question, I guess you were suggesting that if like what are some of the common questions I get from week to week? I get a lot of questions around, how does a recruiter think about how do they review resumes? What do they look for in a resume? Um, you know, the open to work badge on LinkedIn. I've been asked that many, many, many times. What else? How to stand out. I get questions around why I'm not hearing back from a recruiter. I get
Mhm.
questions around, sort of the whole keyword
Mhm.
optimization game on your resume. So just to kind of seed, plant some seeds there, I guess. Happy to kind of go down any path
Well,
you guys would like.
I'm curious, so like so I'm actually about to do my, the NSA program stuff, talk to a couple of recruiters.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering like what types of things, like as if you've done some of the, being on the other side of being the recruiter on that side, like what are some of them, I want to say mistakes, or what is like is there stock advice that you're finding yourself giving people, or just patterns that you're seeing when you're having, giving that feedback of, what kind of job would I be well suited for? What kind of reach? Like what patterns are you seeing there? Does that make sense?
Yeah, so are you referring to that part of the NSA where you go and talk to a recruiter and ask them those, what is it,
Yeah.
three questions? Yeah.
Yeah.
That's really tough right now. It's really tough right now because of where we are in sort of this macroeconomic cycle of hiring, right? It's also tough because this thing called AI is it's becoming this sort of shifting landscape of what it means to be, I don't know, what it means to be a strong product manager, what it means to be a strong and
Mm.
marketable graphic designer or software engineer. So there's a shifting landscape that I think we're working with now that wasn't as prevalent 2 years ago, 3 years ago. Right. And so I think that there's that dynamic there that's introducing a lot of challenge. I would say that, with respect to the question about, what am I, because part of it assumes that there's this sort of trajectory, right? And what you might be a good fit for, it sort of aligns with that current trajectory. What you might be a reach for, or what might be a reach for you is sort of maybe a step function from that trajectory, right? And
Mhm.
what might be a shoe in is just, maybe underselling yourself or just something that you might be settling for. So, when you're asking a recruiter those three questions, I guess my typical response to that is if you look at your resume, it tells a story about a particular trajectory, right? And let's just use a product manager for sake of argument or sake of example, right? If you had a bunch of product management positions and there's some clear trajectory there from associate, for example, to product manager, to senior, to group, to director, right? It might be obvious. It might suggest a story of like, well, my last position was a director. Maybe director is sort of the next natural progression, or maybe something above that, VP. In this right now, it's challenging to even make that jump from director to VP, right? Because it's just there's fewer roles out there. So there's more folks vying for those smaller roles. What I've found is that there's a lot of folks that are even taking a step back. So if they're director, now they're like, okay, I'll settle for, I don't know, group or a senior product management role because there's just more of them out there relative to director, right? So you have sort of that dynamic going on. There's also, what it means to be a director versus, in a larger company versus a smaller company. So that's another thing that's at play too, right? Titles are shortcuts. Titles are shortcuts for typically scope and capacity to reach certain outcomes or accomplishments. So, but recruiters still have to take those with a grain of salt, right? Because they do look at those title shortcuts on your resume within the context of what kind of company you are working at, right? And so that's another thing that's at play. Sorry, I'm kind of veering off a little bit.
Well, I feel
Rainy.
like, and I don't want to mobilize if other folks have questions, but like I'm curious, like, so what advice would you have for us going into these conversations to make the most of it? Because I think like it's great to hear kind of, what you're thinking when, if I come to you with my resume and that type of thing.
Yeah.
But so what advice would you have for us to get the most out of these conversations if, yeah.
Yeah. So if you're gonna talk to a recruiter, I mean, one opportunity, it's one if if you're able to get time with a recruiter, right? I know it can be kind of challenging, but it's an opportunity to build a relationship, especially if it's the kind of recruiter that would be a good fit for you in terms of helping to further your exposure, them potentially being a champion for you, being your eyes and ears. And so I would try to be discerning about which recruiters you try to foster a relationship with because recruiters they work by geography, they work by industry, they work by role or function, they work by even kind of company type, right? More corporate versus more startup, mid-market, SMB, what have you, right? And so I would try to focus your effort in building relationships with the kind of recruiter that aligns with you in those areas, right? It doesn't make sense to put too much effort into building a relationship with a recruiter that doesn't align with you in those along those dimensions, right? I mean, if it's easy to get a conversation with a recruiter that doesn't align, there may be some value, but again, you have to, this whole job search effort is a balancing act of your time and effort, right? And how you allocate that. But to make the most, so once you identify the recruiter that aligns largely, and if you're able to eventually get them on a phone call or get them into a coffee shop with you to spend some time with you, I would try to learn as much as you can from them by you're just being curious and asking good questions, right? And so the other thing is too, you want to be memorable, right? And so if you can approach them by leading with value as opposed to just asking for their time, asking for the input, asking for their feedback, asking for them to be your eyes and ears, you will set yourself apart and you'll be more likely to get a conversation with them if you can lead with that. Because what happens more often than not is most folks are reaching out to recruiters to ask for something, right? Especially now. And when a recruiter's inundated with that, it's hard for them to respond. It's hard for them to respond in a way that is helpful, right? A lot of times they might just ignore the outreach message, right? So if you can lead with that, you're more apt to get their attention. If you can lead with that, once you get them on a phone call or once you get them in an email or in person, if you lead with value, you're more apt to find an ally or a partner in your search as you navigate that. And then the next question that comes up is how do I lead with value? Like, how do I add value? Okay, so you have to understand what a recruiter is interested in, right? And what's their motivations, what are their incentives, and if you can align yourself with that and add value, then you become more of a partner. You elevate yourself from being, a job seeker or a candidate to a partner, right? In sort of a professional sense. And if you could become a friend too, that's awesome, right? And but let's be serious, right? Like most folks are not networking to find friends. Most folks, right? Most folks are networking first and foremost for some sort of business professional relationship, for some sort of business professional reciprocal exchange, right? If you can add friendship to that, that's great. But I mean, to be honest, most folks are not in it just to make friends, right? Right? I mean, yeah. So, okay, lead with value, become a partner, understand what a recruiter is interested. And here's what a recruiter is interested. They're interested in expanding their network with folks that can add value to their searches in the short, medium, or long term. Depending on who the recruiter is, so there's different kinds of recruiters. I'll just take a little departure here really quick. There's internal recruiters that are largely they're largely interested in filling a position. They're not really interested in business development. That's not their thing. There's external recruiters that, they're also called headhunters or agency recruiters, third party recruiters. Those folks at the more junior or mid level, they're interested in filling the positions. At a more senior level, they're interested in business development. So they're interested in acquiring new clients. They're interested in acquiring new requisitions, right? And so you have to size up your recruiter and understand where they fall on that spectrum, to speak, right? What are they interested in? So if they're interested in business development, they're interested in longer term relationship with you and you potentially being a hiring manager at some point in the future, right? And you don't have to overtly put that carrot in front of them, But you could just subtly drop things like, when I hired in the past, when I worked with recruiters in the past on my searches, sort of tip them off, whether consciously or subconsciously, that, hey, this person could be a potentially client for me in the future. And so these are things that you can mention to a recruiter to uh, sort of add value, right? And so again, depending on who the recruiter is, where they are in sort of their maturity and their career, figuring out how to add value to them. And if you can lead with that, you elevate yourself from being more than just a candidate to being sort of a partner to potentially being a client for them, right? And so you start positioning yourself to building a longer term relationship as opposed to this short term, hey, I'm looking for a job. Do you have any leads for me? Can you look at my resume? It's very short term. And as much as candidates kind of get ghosted or burned by recruiters, it happens the other way too, right? It happens the other way where employers or recruiters don't hear from candidates. They don't hear back from them. There's just this short-term thing. So again, if you can position yourself to be more of a longer-term relationship beyond just a job seeker, right? Because this job seeking thing it's an interim thing. It's a temporary thing. I've worked with a lot of folks through that transition over my years. And a lot of times, and I'm not knocking these folks, but a lot of times the relationship is limited to job seeker candidate. And once they get placed, whether I'm placing them or they end up, finding their next position through some other channel, a lot of times I won't hear from them. Despite my efforts to maintain sort of a longer term relationship, I don't hear from them until a few years later. And it's like, oh, hey, Eric, I'm on the market again, would love to catch up. And again, I'm not knocking them, right? Because people are busy. It's fine. But that's what most people do. So I think part of what I can add value in these conversations, in these coffee with recruiter sessions, is I can give you some insight into what people do and what people don't do. And by understanding what people typically do and what people typically don't do, you can understand, how that might come across to a recruiter, right? Because if you're doing everything that a recruiter sees, or everything that all the other candidates are doing, and this, then you can understand like what you might do that's different. So
is it appropriate to, sort of, and to make it more of that partnership, to ask like, hey, what roles are you trying to fill right now? Maybe I know somebody in my network who might be a great fit. Like,
yes,
what would
if you do it
tell them?
genuinely, because not a lot of people, most people don't do that, but the people that do that, there is a fraction of those folks that actually follow through, right? So if you do it genuinely and you actually follow through, that leaves an impression, right? Because recruiters talk to a lot of people. Right. And so there's what people do, what people say, and what people actually take action on. Right. And so sometimes it's just lip service when I hear something like that. Right. So definitely follow through if you can. If you can't follow through, don't present it as an option. Yeah. Because it could discredit you. Right.
How much networking happens within the recruiter community?
Among recruiters?
Yeah, if your recruiters talking to other recruiters, is that a thing you also spend a planned amount of
That's a
time
good question.
each week?
That's a really good question. In my experience, there's a bit of a competitive thing going on among recruiters. Even within recruiting agencies, a lot of recruiters are very similar to, again, I'll speak from my experience and what I've seen. I've seen a lot of recruiters and agencies, they tend to be very competitive among each other, akin to like a sales team, where it's maybe not a complex sale and there isn't as much collaboration required to close a deal. You'll find that, especially if the recruiters are incentivized by big commission checks, they tend to work sort of lone wolf, right? And so where there is collaboration, is usually among more senior level searches where there's a bit of a more scratch my back, I'll scratch your back. And I would say there's less than 10 folks in my network recruiters that I can trust and that are more long-term oriented that I can pass candidates to, because I know that they'll pass them back to me or pass others back to me. And it's not just candidates, right, in this ecosystem. What's valuable to recruiters, more specifically third-party recruiters, right, agency recruiters, is sort of supply and demand. Right. So it's the talent side, so strong candidates, but it's also the requisitions, the clients. Right. And so in terms of networking with other recruiters or other agencies over the years, I would say there's probably less than 10 that I would say I have a deep relationship with, that I trust, and I can pass stuff back and forth. Stuff being, either client referrals, like maybe it's a client that I can't handle, or it's a client that I don't specialize in, or they have a very unique need, then I would pass that on if it doesn't align with me. And then similarly with the talent side, there may be talent that I come across that is, highly specialized, and maybe I've never worked with that kind of talent before, and I don't have any network in terms of the demand side or the client side, the hiring side. But maybe I know somebody maybe I know a recruiter or an agency that does more work in that area. Again, be it domain or industry, be it seniority or function or region, right? I'm in the Mountain West region, so most recruiters tend to be sort of align themselves along those dimensions again.
That makes sense. I have someone who I'm working with on a not yet funded startup side who had someone reach out to them, and they said, "Well, this is the kind of person who only reaches out to me when they absolutely need something from me." And we've worked together in the past, and I understand that's the dynamic. I compare that of people who only reach out when they need something to being more collegial. There must be other people that are more broadly accepting and willing to chat, but I understand the competitive side you're talking about.
Yeah. And also that I can see that voice in a lot of people's heads of, oh, I don't want to be that person that only reaches out when they need something. You have to temper that too, right? Because, I mean, and I try not to hold that against people, right? Because if you need help, ask. The worst they could do is sort of look at you funny and turn you down, right? So that voice is in my head too. It's like, oh man, like I have a big network, I need, maybe I need something from this person. I haven't reached out to that person in 15 years, you know, um, should I reach out to them or not? Oh, I might come across as one of those people that only reaches out when they need something. So you have to temper that voice too, because, if you need help, don't be afraid to ask for it, but also at the same time, but, think about, how you might be able to add value to them.
I think Pei had a question in the chat also.
Is there, okay, sorry, let me see.
Thank you.
Okay, Pay, the recruiter, let's see. The recruiter during the initial call asked me the salary of my previous job was. Is that okay to ask? When is a good time to negotiate salary? I feel the company leaves it to the recruiter to check in and ask about my salary expectation. If I don't have an interview, I think I should be having that conversation with the hiring manager, not the recruiter. Is that right? Okay, so there's a lot to unpack here. Some recruiters will ask you what you were making at your previous job. I typically don't ask that. What's most important is what your salary expectations are. That's what's most important, right? Because as a recruiter, this is a really good question, by the way, Pei. As a recruiter, I have an understanding typically of what the market will sustain for a given role, title, years of experience, what have you. And I also have an understanding of what's budgeted for that particular role, for that requisition within the company. And so I have an understanding of, what's too high and whether whether there's room for negotiation, right? Because sometimes there is, sometimes there's not. And so typically the recruiter has visibility into this, whether they're internal or they're external. They typically have visibility. Again, you have to size up your recruiter. If your recruiter is a junior recruiter, all they're doing is probably sourcing. They might not have line of sight to the account manager, or they might not have line of sight to the hiring manager if they're a third-party recruiter. And so they may have less visibility into where there is room to negotiate, right? So again, you have to size up your recruiter. Okay. So I typically won't ask, oh, what are you currently making, or what were you making? I will typically ask, what are your salary expectations, right? And so as a candidate, you need to be informed of what your salary expectations could or should be. And to be informed, you have to put yourself out in the market. You have to talk to people. You have to have an understanding of, I'll just use product manager. What a product manager with 6 to 8 years of experience typically makes at a 100-person startup or 100-person company in the Midwest or in the East Coast or the West Coast, right? Like you have to understand what your market value is, right? And so you have to be informed. Most recruiters tend to be informed, at least with the market. At least your good recruiters will be informed, right? So if they ask you, what were you making at your previous job? You could tell them, well, here's what I'm hoping for. Here's what I'm hoping for in my next position, right? If you don't feel comfortable saying what you're currently making, some folks are comfortable with it, some folks are not. The folks that are not comfortable with it, what I've found is that they're typically not comfortable with it because they feel like it's sort of pegging them at some lower mark where they should be at a higher mark, right? And so, but what's most important really is what your expectations are, right? It's not so much what you were making, it's more what your expectations are. And so those expectations should be commensurate with the role. They should be commensurate with what the market will sustain, right? So when is it a good time to negotiate salary? Day one. That's the best time, right? Negotiations start at the beginning. And I'm not talking like hardball negotiations, but what I'm talking about is really position yourself to negotiate, right? Being a team member that they want on their team, right? And so the negotiation starts and it's very subtle. It's not even, many folks won't even call it negotiation, but it's being informed, it's coming to the table informed, right? It's the hardest person to negotiate with is the person that's not informed nor skilled at negotiation, right? I as a recruiter would much rather negotiate with somebody that's informed and skilled at negotiation. And so if you could demonstrate that you are informed and you are skilled at negotiation and you know your value from day one, that is somebody I'm more apt to negotiate with. And I can make more So there's this idea, of how do you say, like zero sum negotiation. And then there's this idea of collaborative negotiation. I tend to be more on the collaborative negotiation side. If I could be an advocate for you and for the company in expanding the pie, let's do that, right? There's other folks that look at negotiation as this zero sum game, right? Where it's like we got to fight over this slice. Like if I'm making, if we're giving more compensation to the candidate, then somehow that takes away from the company, right? And so part of it again is sizing up your recruiter to understand like what role they might play in that negotiation process. But to answer your question succinctly, negotiation starts from the first point of contact, right? And you're building a case for yourself, right? As a strong person that's bringing value to the team, that's helping to solve a problem for the recruiter, that's helping to solve a problem for the hiring manager, and ultimately helping to solve a problem for the team and for the company, right? By what value you're bringing to the table, right? And so the way you do that is, again, being informed, being a problem solver. And the problem isn't just, what's on the job description. The problem for the recruiter is how do I find the right person, right? And so hopefully that sheds a little bit of light there. I feel the company leaves it for the recruiter to do check-in and ask about my salary after the final round of interview. So on the first conversation, a lot of times the recruiter will ask, what is your comp expectations? Give them a range, and make sure that range is realistic and it's informed, but then also signal that compensation is only one part of what you're looking for in the right opportunity. So you're signaling flexibility, and you're also signaling the desire and the appetite to work with the recruiter and the company, right? Assuming it's the right fit, right? And so your goal aligns with theirs, which is finding the right fit, right? When your goal is just to sell them on you're positioning yourself like most other candidates. But when you're positioning yourself as, let's figure out if this is the right fit, because nobody wins if it's the wrong fit. I don't win as a candidate. I don't win, they don't win as a recruiter, as a hiring team, if it's the wrong fit. They'd much rather, what they don't want to have happen, and this is a risk for recruiters, right, is they don't want this person to be hired and then, inside of 3 months, 6 months, 12 months, they determine it's the wrong fit. It's very costly for everybody. It's very costly for everybody, right? And so they want to avoid that situation. So again, to the extent that you can signal that you're aligned with finding the right long-term fit, then you sort of distance yourself a little bit from this used car salesperson thing of like, oh, I got to sell myself. I got to, tout, why I'm such a good fit for this position and how I check all the boxes and this and that, right? So you could try to distance yourself from that a little bit. It comes across, right? Talking to a lot of folks, you could see when someone is just trying to vie for that position as opposed to helping me solve that problem of finding the right person. Let's see. I want to make sure I'm addressing your questions here, Pei.
Yeah, I think, you addressed it. I think it's just, I find it a little bit weird because what happened is that the recruiter asked me for expectation. I gave a range in the initial call. And at the end of the final round, he was like checking in with me to say, has your expectation changed based on what you found out about during the interview?
Yes.
And I said, I did not change the expectation, like expectation stays the same, but then I still didn't get the role because they were resizing the role. So I'm just kind of like wondering why they're asking me that when they already kind of are thinking about resizing the role.
They're asking, the question that they asked you later in the process was, did your expectations change?
Yeah.
That's not an uncommon question. It's a common question because people's expectations they do change. So if you look at an interview process, let's just say it's 4 weeks, right? You as a candidate are learning more about the role, about the company, but you're also probably talking to other companies as well, right? And so as part of that process of talking to other companies, doing market research, I've seen a lot of expectations change. And it goes both ways, right? Maybe they have higher expectations of compensation, they have low expectations of compensation. And so I've seen it go both ways. So it's not uncommon for a person's expectations to evolve as a function of their interview efforts and activities, either with that company or in parallel with other companies. Right. So it's a fair question. When you're talking about resizing the role, I assume like the scope of the role or the title might be evolving or changing one way or the other.
I mean, recruiter at the end was telling me that this role should be 3 roles. So they are meeting again with like all the heads of PD
Hmm.
to kind of reconsider that. And so I further asked him, well, could this be someone that can, take on the lead role? Because this is the first role of the company that they're creating. And then later on in the year, like hire someone junior to support that. Like I was trying to come up with collaborative solution.
Yeah.
And then he was like, he didn't say anything back. He said, I need to get back to my team about that. And then there was no follow up. So I assume that that's just like the end of it or something. So,
Yeah. It's tough when a company is sort of at that maturity stage where, they've never hired for a given role. It's tough because there's a learning curve that goes along with that. Whether that's a company that's never hired for the role, the team, or the hiring manager. If they've never hired for the role, there's a learning curve. And I mean, I hate to say this, but there's some portion of folks that are early in that process that are just sort of like they're just part of that learning process for the company. So they may talk, because I've done this a lot with clients that have never hired for a given role. So typically what happens is I'll work with them putting a job description together. And again, the job description is just an artifact of a deeper process of understanding what the company needs are, the team needs are, blah, 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 right? And so we'll work with them to understand what the need is. That usually gets translated as a job description. And then we'll go to the market to look for folks that fit that job description or are capable of doing that, capable of filling that role. And then there's a learning process, right? We'll get folks in, they'll talk to the team. The team will, feel like, oh, they hit the mark here, they missed the mark here. And sometimes there's a sort of an iteration, maybe 2 iterations of refining their understanding of the need and ultimately what that job description looks like, right? And so it's not just the job description or the role that's being defined, it's also the organization structure. So there's a lot of like moving parts, right? I mean, you kind of alluded to it, right? Like there's a certain need, and how is that need going to be met? It might be met by one senior person. It might be met by a mid-level person, followed shortly thereafter by an entry-level person, right? And so which path do they take to design that organization? A lot of times they don't know, right? They don't know, and a lot of times it's a little bit they try to be proactive about it, but then maybe they're a little bit reactive as they start talking to more people. And so it's possible that what you might be experiencing is that you're part of that learning curve for them. And so there is a little bit of a recency bias too, because sometimes that interview process gets protracted. It's not just an interview process, right? There's another process that's going on in parallel, which is they're trying to figure out what the role is and what the organization is going to look like, right? And that happens in sometimes in parallel with that interview process. And so if you're early on in that process may be protracted, right? It may be going for like 2 or 3 months, especially if it's a more senior kind of role, right? And so there is sort of a recency bias. So to the extent that you can be top of mind throughout the process, because it may be protracted, it might be like 3 months, it might be 4 months, maybe even be longer. So what I'm saying is don't write the recruiter off, and don't assume that just because you haven't heard from him or her that you've been written off, especially if it's the first time that they're hiring for this role. If you know that information, you can assume that they're trying to figure stuff out. So, try to decouple your emotions from it. I know that could be challenging, but just set a calendar reminder to check in with so-and-so every week, every 2 weeks, every 3 weeks, just sort of expressing interest, Yeah, I hope that helps. The one thing that I was looking at your thing here, should you be negotiating with the recruiter? Yes, typically yes. Typically
oh, okay, not the hiring manager. I thought it was the hiring manager.
Well, so usually, and again, you have to size up your recruiter. If you know that the recruiter is more senior, they've been around, they have a relationship with the hiring manager, line of sight, they have a relationship with them, you can largely assume that that recruiter is a proxy for the hiring manager, right? A lot of times the hiring manager, they don't have time to be doing a lot of the legwork as far as negotiation. So they'll rely on the recruiter to do that. So should you be negotiating with the recruiter? It depends on how senior that recruiter is. If they're an entry level person that, maybe a year out of school, you want to negotiate. And what I mean by negotiate, right, is you should be to the extent that you can, you should be transparent with your recruiter, right? But when I say, you have to temper your expectations of what the recruiter is capable of as part of the negotiation process. If they're an entry level recruiter, they're new. Maybe they don't have line of sight to the hiring manager. Maybe they're insulated between the hiring manager by an account manager, right? And so you have to temper your expectations of what that recruiter will be capable of doing or advocating on your behalf as part of the negotiation process. If they're more senior, if they have line of sight, then you could probably have higher expectation that they have more influence as part of the negotiation process, right? So if you're working with a recruiter that is more junior, what can you do in that situation? Well, you could try to, enable him or her to be, a strong champion on your behalf to the extent that they can. Throughout the process, I would also, not that you wouldn't do this anyway, but try to build a relationship with these folks along the process, whether it's whoever you're interviewing with. You usually don't have an opportunity to build a relationship with the account manager. And the account managers, I'm using this word account manager, in a third party or in a third party recruiting situation where there's a recruiting agency. If you're working with a junior recruiter, typically there's an account manager that manages the relationship with the client, right? And typically as a candidate, you're not getting any visibility into who that person is, what they're doing. Usually you're building a relationship with the recruiter, and then the recruiter is sending their submissions or write-ups of you as a candidate to the account manager, and that account manager may be sending that along to the hiring manager. That's one scenario. Or the recruiter maybe have line of sight to the hiring manager. That's something you could try to flesh out, right? And there's some assumptions you can make by just virtue of how long that person has been working as a recruiter, how long that agency's been working with that client or that hiring manager. So you can start to piece that together.
Yeah, I appreciate this. Thank you, Eric. This is very detailed analysis of it. Yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, there's so much more nuance here, but I want to make sure that I'm getting the big blocks and the big rocks. Trying to think if there's anything to add to that for now.
It's just funny that you mentioned used car salesman, because the recruiter said that don't trust anything the recruiter said. Recruiters are used car salesmen. Like he said that in the final interview.
He said not to trust recruiters.
Yes.
So I think I understand where that's coming from. Recruiting, there's a really low bar. There's a really low barrier to entry to becoming a recruiter. I mean, if you have a cell phone, if you have a laptop, you could be a recruiter, right? So the barrier to entry. So that said, is that there's quite a wide range. There's quite a distribution of the kinds of recruiters there are out there. And so I think as a candidate, as somebody that's navigating their job search, you'd be wise to be discerning about who you're working with as a recruiter, or what kind of recruiter you're working with, right? And temper your expectations accordingly. And I think what he's saying is legitimate in some sense. Like, there are recruiters that will just say anything to close a deal. Because in recruiting, and I think this is changing actually, by the way, recruiting historically, there's big money to be made in recruiting. A typical agency can make 25% of the first year annual salary on making a placement. So for let's say a 200K person, that's 50 grand. That's a lot of money just to close a candidate, right? And so yes, some recruiters, I mean, there's some incentive for unscrupulous practices that you should be aware of. Yeah. So, and then, again, with the low barriers to entry to becoming a recruiter, you have to be careful and kind of have to size up your recruiter. I'm just trying to think if there's anything to add to that. I'll probably think of a bunch of things later on. So it doesn't hurt to ask the same question next time, because I'll probably think of other things that are relevant, but I think I've sort of exhausted that for now.
Eric, what do you think of the pace of recruiting in 2025 compared to 2024?
I think so.
Demands on your time, the amount of contacts you're handling, that kind of thing.
Yeah. So me, anecdotally, I'm making a bit of a career pivot right now. And so I've been doing recruiting for a long time, and I'm looking at ways that I could start building solutions that help recruiters and help employers, largely on the back of this emerging technology, AI, right? AI is amazing in that it can, it can basically add intelligence and cognition to all these different parts of the process or value chain, which can elevate what a recruiter is capable of doing in terms of their attention to the actual human, right? And so these are some of the solutions that I'm looking to couple my domain experience in recruiting with some of this technical experience and it's one of the things I miss personally is building things. I went into engineering back in the days because I like tinkering and building stuff. Somehow I became a recruiter, and learning about humans and learning about process and learning about psychology was and it is quite an adventure because humans are amazing, right? Like, and the psychology behind all this is fascinating. But I think personally, in terms of my own career, and I'm sort of coming back full circle to try to integrate what I've learned about humans, what I love about technology, and sort of figuring out how I can create solutions that address market need. So, long story short, I think recruiting is going to change. It's already changing quite a bit. And I think, like a lot of many other functions and areas of specialization, I think AI is going to enable a lot of it, and people are going to be doing more with less. And I think that I think it's something for a lot of folks to consider too. As you look at your experience and what it means to be a product manager, software developer, a product marketer, whatever, and look at what it means to operate in that role, how that's evolving, how that's evolving, because I feel like it's a bit of a moving target. So I would encourage folks to think about, how these new technologies are going to enable you in your role and in craft, and start to apply some of those technologies to make you a better fill in the blank, right? Did that hear your question, Matthew? I don't think it did. As far as activity, I am not actively recruit. My wife and I, we work in a boutique recruiting firm. Her career is still more on the recruiting side. I've kind of focused my career more so on building solutions that enable her. And by virtue of enabling her, it can enable other recruiters, other agencies, and other employers. And so I'm still early stages in terms of developing some of these solutions to address some of those needs. So what I'm saying is I don't know. I don't know. I think from what I've seen, things have slowed in terms of hiring. And this is my experience over the past 2 years. I don't have a crystal ball, but I think hiring, especially on the tech side, is going to be slower unless you have some specific niche skills related to, let's say, AI or machine learning. But I don't know. I think the skill that's going to be increasingly valuable is the skill of connecting the dots, and, specialization, which was valued highly over the past 20, 30 years. I think maybe the pendulum might be swinging the other way. And the ability to be a product manager that, oh, by the way, can build something and launch something. And by the way, that product manager can also be very capable in designing their own brand or, visual interface or whatnot. I think those siloed functions are kind of blurring a little bit. And, as a product manager, you can start doing your own development, no code, low code. You can start doing your own graphic design. You could put out your own MVP, maybe even something, production worthy. And so I think those lines are blurring now of what a person's capable of doing. Like, you don't have to be a coder to put code to build something. You don't have to be a designer to have a sound visual design or brand design. And I think product managers, I mean, I keep using the word product manager, but like your ability to kind of connect the dots and to have these sensibilities in these other domains, I think is going to be an increasingly valuable skill. You don't have to be a designer to have a design sensibility. You don't have to be a coder to have, a sensibility of what it takes to build and launch something. And now that sensibility, coupled with AI, you can start actually taking action on it. Sarah.
Yes, hi everyone. Hi Eric. I joined a bit late, I'm sorry. And I know we're reaching the top of the hour, so I'm totally fine if this question is kicked to an online response or a future meet. It's absolutely okay. But you mentioned AI and its power. I'm kind of on the other side of the fence, like more AI skeptic. And so my questions are, do you see a risk of seeing more inflated profile, either through LinkedIn's or resumes, because of the use of AI? And if so, How is that impacting the job market and the recruiting process?
Yeah, that's an arms race. That's a good question. I think there's going to be sort of this early adopter thing going on. So I can tell you right now, based on a lot of LinkedIn profiles and resumes I've seen, not everybody is using AI to refine their LinkedIn profiles and their resumes, right? And the folks that are more adept or savvy or more early adopterish, they're moving quickly and they're able to refine their resumes and their brand, their personal professional brand, their LinkedIn profiles more effectively. And there's always going to be this sort of, I don't know, what's the word? Slow adopter or laggard, right? There's always going to be those folks. Ideally, if you are positioning yourself as an early adopter and you have working that muscle of learning quickly, moving quickly, adapting quickly, I think you'll be in a good place. But the point that you're bringing, I think, is one that's really interesting because the folks that are moving quickly, the folks that are using AI to refine their resumes, and I think this will become just increasingly more prevalent. For example, like folks are using this, they're taking job descriptions, they're using the job description as input to refine the resumes, and now the resumes are optimized for that particular job description. And so what does that end up with? Is you end up with if you follow that to its logical conclusion, if everybody was doing that, now you have a recruiter looking at all these overly optimized resumes. And now how do they discern? It becomes a challenge for the recruiter. Like, how do they discern who's the optimal fit or who they're going to start with? Right. And so it becomes a bit of an arms race. Then the recruiter starts applying AI to evaluating the stack of 500 resumes, and it becomes a little bit of an arms race. Right. And so, not to say you shouldn't do that. Not to say you shouldn't optimize your resume for a given job description, because there's a lot of people that aren't. They're not doing it because either they're not adept at it, they don't know how to use AI in sort of that 1% capacity. And so, yeah, it becomes an arms race. Not to say you shouldn't engage in the arms race, but you also have to be creative too about other ways to position yourself. So, like branding yourself on LinkedIn, creating content, positioning yourself as sort of a thought leader or somebody that's proficient in their domain or their craft is something that I'm always a big advocate of, because the recruiter will start to look beyond the resume. They'll look at your LinkedIn profile. They'll look at other ways that other forms of your digital presence. They'll start to look at beyond your resume. And again, that's going to be another area that people will increasingly start to use AI to refine. Not everybody's there yet, right? But if you could be sort of at that leading edge, you'll stand out. But yeah, I think one of the skills beyond connecting the dots is just learning quickly and not resting on your laurels of what you've learned or what you think you know. And that's hard for most people. It's hard for me. It's hard for a lot of folks.
Thank you.
We're at the top of the hour, you guys. Any last minute questions? We can always table it for next week too. Sorry, let me look at sorry, I'm missing the chat here. Do I see risk of more or inflated profiles? Yeah, this is your question, right, Sarah?
Yeah.
Totally.
Yeah.
There's going to
So
be a
then,
disconnect. There's going to be a disconnect between the digital representation and the actual person. Because the digital representation, as people become more adept to using AI to craft their digital representation, the digital representation becomes, more optimized, right? But then there's going to be more of a gap between the digital representation and the actual person.
Right. Unless you
So-
train to learn, like you teach AI your language and you kind of do a mix of you learning AI and AI learning about you, and you're able to create that blend profile that still use your current competencies and skills, but word it in a way that's enhanced. And so that's still an accurate depiction of who you are. It's enhanced and not completely fake, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it's sort of top down versus bottom up. Totally,
Yeah.
right? Bottom up, I think what you're suggesting is like use AI to really, and this is what I alluded to earlier. I don't think you were on the call here, Sarah. Pei, I think you were on the call. Part of what I'm doing here is I'm trying to tease out the essence of Eric, at least in the professional or recruiting sense, in these recordings so I can transcribe them and use that to inform some sort of AI model, bot or knowledge base, right? And so that's sort of bottom up, right? The top down is sort of like, okay, I have this job description. Now I need to make myself the perfect fit for that job description, right? And so, yeah, so it's top down, bottom up. I think that if you do both well, where, you're sort of teasing out the essence of Sarah and making a digital representation that is authentic and it's true to who Sarah is, coupled with the top down, which is I have this job description. How do I position my digital representation to be a good fit for that, to really highlight the key attributes of Sarah that align with the need of this job description. If that makes sense. So it's sort of a top-down, bottom-up exercise. If you're just doing top-down, I think that's what we were talking about. Like the digital representation will fall short. There'll be a gap between the digital representation of Sarah and who Sarah really is as a person, right? That I'm interviewing on the phone or in Zoom or in person, right? And so you want to make sure that gap is minimized, right? You don't want to oversell yourself digitally. And I think,
Yeah, no,
and maybe that's a lower risk for a lot of people, right? Maybe what somebody might be considered overselling themselves is really just a sufficient level of salesmanship to get themselves in the door, right? And maybe erring on the side of overselling yourself is what's needed right now. I don't know the answer to that question, but it's kind of philosophical, I guess.
but when you say there's a risk of overselling, because then there's it's deceptive because,
Yeah. The
right?
risk of overselling yourself is getting sort of sort of pre-qualified for roles that you're not gonna
Perform for during that.
perform in, or you just might get rejected in an actual in-person interview. It's a waste of your time, right? If you
Mhm.
oversell yourself and you're not able to deliver like in an interview, it's a waste of your time. At
Yeah.
worst, you end up getting hired for the role, and then the shoes are too big for you to fill.
And that's a bad place to be in, yeah.
That's a bad place
Yeah.
for you to be. It's a bad place for the recruiter, a bad place for the team.
So
I mean,
then,
there's always some element of oversells,
yeah.
right? Like, because ideally you want to get into a role that you can kind of grow into. But if the role is too big, you're not set up for success.
Yeah. No, thank you. Just a last short question on the AI piece. You talked about the first wave of adopter. Would you say that if I start optimizing my profile today, we're still, if we start to do that, we're still part of the first wave, or we're already behind? It seems to me, based on the people I talk to, we're kind of already behind, no?
Yeah, what I would recommend is learning how to use ChatGPT in a very nuanced way, right? And that includes learning how to ask good questions, learning how to provide context, learning how to be specific and precise in your language. I tell you, like I've learned so much just by interacting with ChatGPT, with these large language models in terms of my prompting and how important it is to be precise in your language, Something as simple as, hey, help me brainstorm some ideas around subject lines for my emails. Like you could be so much more precise in that. It's like, help me brainstorm 5 unique ideas. I mean, the difference between some and 5, it's a level of precision that I've learned in interacting with these AI models. And that carries into my interactions with humans as well, right? Because the more precise you are in your language, whether it's how you're interacting with a recruiter, like a human being, or with an AI, it will yield more precise outcomes or results. And so, be precise in your language, learn how to ask good questions, learn the limitations of what these AI platforms are constrained by, right? It's a moving benchmark, I guess. But that's what I would suggest, because there's a lot of people that are using ChatGPT, but they're not really, really using it. And they've hit this asymptote of, well, ChatGPT can't write like me. Truth is, they're not prompting it in a way that is really enabling it to write like them. They're not informing it in a way. They're not providing a level of context. They're not tuning it in a way that will write like them, right? And so they reach this asymptote and they're just like, oh, that's the limitation. When in reality, a lot of the limitation has to do with their capability of asking questions, of providing it context, of providing it feedback, and to really engage in a meaningful, nuanced conversation with it. I hope that helps.
Yes, awesome. Thank you.
I appreciate you guys. Tell a friend. I'll be back next week. I have to look at my calendar. If you want me to add you to the calendar invite, which is separate and apart from the registration, just message me or Slack me or whatever. And I hope this was helpful for you guys. And I'll see you next week.
So
Thank
3
you.
p.m. 3 p.m. Central, right?
I think it's 2 p.m. Mountain Time.
Yeah, so 3 p.m.
3 p.m. Central.
Today
Thursdays.
was an odd one, I guess.
Today was an odd day. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Eric.
Thanks,
Really
Sarah.
appreciate
Thanks,
it.
Ray. Of
Bye.
course. Talk to you soon. Bye.